The Struggle Against the Passions by St. Paisios the Athonite, from St. Paisios' Spiritual Counsels, Volume 5, Passions and Virtues. Yerunda, what did the prophet David mean when he said, "Uphold me with a governing spirit"? Prophet David was seeking the gift of administration from God because he had to govern people. But every person needs a governing spirit in order to govern his own self, so that he is not ruled by his passions. Yerunda, what are the passions? I see the passions as powers of the soul. God does not grant weaknesses, he grants powers. But when we do not exercise these powers for what is good, then the devil comes to exploit them, and they become passions, and afterwards we complain and blame God. On the other hand, if we exercise these powers against evil, they will help us in the spiritual struggle. For instance, anger indicates that the soul possesses manliness which helps in the spiritual life. One who is not hot-tempered and lacks manliness won't be able to easily put his self, ego, into place. If an irascible person utilizes this power of his in the spiritual life, then he's like a car racing steadily on a straight road. But if this power is not properly utilized, and one leaves himself unrestrained, then he's like a car spinning out of control on rough terrain. One has to become aware of his powers and utilize them for what is good. This is how he can attain, with the help of God, a good spiritual state. Egoism, for example, should be turned against the devil, so that one does not succumb to temptations. The tendency to loquaciousness ought to be sanctified by cultivating the Jesus prayer. Isn't it better to talk with Christ and be sanctified, rather than to chatter away in sin? In other words, one can become good or bad, depending on how he will utilize the powers of the soul. We should not justify our passions. Yerunda, some people think that they don't have what it takes to develop a spiritual life, and so they say, "You cannot receive from one who does not have." And if they also justify themselves by saying that they are burdened by inherited passions, that is even worse. Yerunda, what if someone is indeed burdened with such passions? Look, let me tell you. Each person has hereditary qualities, both good and evil. One must struggle to be delivered from his weaknesses and cultivate what is good in him, in order to become a true, grace-filled image of God. The negative inherited traits are not a hindrance to spiritual progress, for when one is struggling, even slightly, but with great philotimo, then he's moving in the spiritual realm, in the miraculous, and all the unpleasant inherited traits are dispelled by the grace of God. God is greatly moved, and indeed helps the one who may have inherited negative traits but is struggling, with philotimo, to fly heavenwards, using an atrophied wing, the bad inheritance. I know many people who, with their own small amount of effort and the great help of God, were delivered from their legacies. In God's eyes, these people are great heroes, for what moves God is the work we do on the old man within. Yerunda, aren't the bad inherited traits removed by holy baptism? Holy baptism delivers us from the curse of the ancestral original sin and from all sins. When a person is baptized, he is vested with Christ, delivered from the ancestral sin, and the grace of God abides in him. However, the bad inherited traits remain. Perhaps you don't think that God can remove those as well, through holy baptism. He can, but he allows them to remain so that we may struggle and be crowned with victory. Yerunda, when I keep falling into some passion, I say, "This is how I was born. This is who I am." That's all we needed to hear. The next thing you'll tell us is that your parents have given you all the weaknesses you have. From forefather to forefather, all of the family's weaknesses came down to you, and all the gifts went to the others? Are you also blaming God? Whoever says, "This is my personality, this is how I was born, I have inherited repulsive traits, I grew up under these conditions, therefore I cannot correct myself," is like saying, "Not only are my father and mother to blame, but also God himself." Do you know how troubled I am when I hear such things? This is how one reviles both their parents and God. The moment one begins to think this way, the grace of God ceases to act. Yerunda, some people say that when a weakness is in the very structure of a person, it cannot be corrected. Do you know why they say that? Some people find it advantageous to say that a particular weakness of theirs is a part of their makeup, who they are, just so they can justify themselves and make no effort to be delivered from it. Such people say, God has not granted me any gifts. It's not my fault. Why do people expect things from me that are beyond my capabilities? That's how they take advantage of opportunities. They justify themselves, content with their thinking, and living their life as they always have. If we keep on lamenting, these weaknesses are inherited, the other ones are part of my character, how can we ever correct ourselves? This kind of thinking dispels our spiritual levantia. Yes, Yerunda, but there goes that but again. My child, you are as slippery as an eel. You are constantly making excuses for yourself. Yerunda, am I doing this on purpose? I am not saying that you are doing it on purpose, but even though God has endowed you with such a sharp and intelligent mind, you don't seem to understand how bad it is to make excuses. How can such a little tiny head with so much brain in it not understand this? I have noticed that some people, while smart and capable of knowing what is right, nevertheless favor what is wrong only because it is convenient for them, and thus they can then justify their passions. Then there are others who do not justify themselves, but fall into despair just by thinking that there's something incorrigible in their character. This is how the devil works. He hinders one from making spiritual progress by prompting him to justify himself, while he exploits the oversensitivity of another, throwing him into despair. In order to cast out a passion, one should not justify himself, but humble himself instead. If, for example, one says, I have no love within my nature, but the other person does, and makes no effort to acquire this love, how can he ever make progress? There can be no progress without a struggle. Haven't you read in the patristic writings of how many weaknesses some of the fathers had, and of what great spiritual heights they attained? They surpassed others who had a great many virtues. Take, for example, Abba Moses the Ethiopian, a notorious criminal who attained great heights of spirituality. The things the grace of God does. I think that one who inherited bad traits but struggles to acquire virtues will receive a greater reward than one who inherited virtues from his parents and doesn't have to struggle to acquire them. You see, he had them handed to him, whereas the other had to struggle hard to acquire them. Most of us have a greater appreciation for those who not only struggled hard to pay off debts inherited from their parents, but even created their own fortune, as opposed to those who inherited fortunes from their parents and merely maintained it. Revealing the passions. Yerunda, I am troubled by my passions. Do you recognize that there are passions within you? I recognize this sometimes. That is good. A person who acknowledges his passions humbles himself, and then the grace of God comes. But I get upset over constantly making mistakes. You should be glad at being constantly wrong, for you have pride, and this is how you are humbled. Say, My Lord, this is who I am. Help me. If you do not help me, I will not be able to do anything. Do not despair. Whenever we make a mistake, our real self is revealed. We come to know him and try to correct ourselves. This is how we can move forward confidently and not live with a false impression that we are doing well. I personally am glad when a weakness of mine displays itself, when my passions sprout up. If they didn't, then I would have thought that I had become holy, while the seeds of the passions would have been hidden in my heart. You too, when you get angry or censure someone, will be grieved, of course, because you fell, but you should also be glad, because your weakness was made manifest, which will then prompt you to struggle to be delivered from it. Yerunda, When a passion of mine lies dormant for a period of time, does this mean that it no longer exists within me? If there is passion within you, it will display itself at some point. This is why you must be careful if you know that some passion is hidden inside you. If you know, for example, that there's a snake hiding somewhere outside your monastic cell, you will look around for it when you step outside in case it comes out and bites you. It's not dangerous to know that the snake is there and to be aware so that you can kill it when it comes out. It is dangerous if you're not aware of its presence and walk carelessly because it can bite you. In other words, it's dangerous when a person doesn't keep track of himself and is not aware of his passions. When one is aware of his passions and carries out the necessary struggle, then Christ helps him to uproot them. Yerunda, should I just struggle without worrying if I have corrected myself? Perhaps the rectification belongs to God. Yes, just struggle and leave it all to God, but you also ought to examine yourself to see where you are, what you are doing. You see, a doctor first tries to discover the cause of the fever and then decides on what medicine to prescribe to the patient in order to decrease the fever. In other words, as soon as a person begins to see his weaknesses, he must feel the good restlessness over them in order to struggle to correct them. I examine myself and recognize that I have certain weaknesses. I undertake my struggle to correct them, and again, I examine myself. Up until yesterday, I had these weaknesses. Have I corrected any of them? How am I doing with that one? Then I say in my prayer, My Lord, I'm doing all I can, but you must help me rectify myself, because I cannot do it alone. Yerunda, could it be that one doesn't have the strength to see his passions? When a person is overly sensitive, God does not allow him to recognize his passions all at once. You see, such a person is also tempted by the devil, who can easily cause him to fall into despair. Why do you have this passion? Why did you do this? Why that? It's obvious you are beyond salvation. By putting such thoughts into his mind, the devil can send a sensitive person to the psychiatric ward. The defender of the passions is pride. Yerunda, what is happening when a soul is struggling for years but sees no progress? When we do not see progress in our struggle, it means that either we are not vigilant or God does not allow us to advance any more so that we will not be harmed by becoming prideful. Yerunda, as I see myself, I am getting worse every day. What will happen to me? Look, Blessed One, there are 3 stages. In the first stage, God gives out caramels and chocolates because he sees the need and the weakness of the soul. In the second stage, God slightly removes his grace for training purposes, so that we can realize that without God's help, we cannot accomplish even the least and must therefore humble ourselves and feel the need to take refuge in him. The third stage is a permanent and steadfast good spiritual state. You seem to be somewhere between the second and third stages. You advance a little, then you forget your weakness, and Christ removes his grace. Deprived of divine grace, you see your weakness again and begin to recover. If you had said to me that as you advance you become better, then I would have been scared, for I would have seen that you were prideful. But now that you say you see yourself getting worse, I am glad, for I see that you are well. Do not fear. The more one advances, the more he is able to detect his weaknesses and his imperfections, and that is progress. Yerunda, is it possible that God does not hear my prayer when I ask for his help in being delivered from a particular passion? Why doubt? Is our God like Baal? God hears our prayer and helps us. Perhaps you do not feel his help, but do not blame God for that. Blame yourself instead. You have rejected his help with your pride. When there is no danger of becoming conceited and prideful, then God will certainly help. The good God desires that we be delivered from our passions, but if we have pride or the predisposition to become prideful, then he does not help us to be delivered from our passions, for then we will imagine that we achieved it without his help. As such, When we pray with all our heart for God to deliver us from a particular passion, and He does not help us, then we must immediately understand that behind this passion an even greater one is hidden, and that is pride. In other words, since we do not recognize pride, God allows the easily recognized passion to return. For example, gluttony, idle talk, anger, and so forth, thus keeping us humble. When we become repulsed by our passions because of our constant falling, recognize our weakness, and become humble, then God helps us to climb the spiritual steps, 2 at a time. The passions are uprooted easily when they are still tender. Yarinda, I see I have many passions. Yes, you do have many passions, but you also have your youth and plenty of polycharia to work at uprooting all the thorny weeds from your garden, replacing them with lilies, hyacinths, roses, so that you may rejoice in your garden. Footnote: Polycharia is the composite of bravery, strength, fearlessness, gallantry, and fortitude. Now that you are young, the passions are tender and can be easily uprooted. You see, the wild weeds, even if they are thorny, can be easily uprooted when they are still tender, but when they grow to maturity they harden, and it is difficult to take hold of them in order to uproot them. Even the nettle, when it first sprouts, is not that different in tenderness from the sweet basil. You can touch it and smell it because it is tender. This is why you should try to uproot your passions when you are young, because if you neglect them, your soul will be overtaken by various desires, and it will be difficult to be delivered from them. Those who do not manage to uproot their passions early on suffer quite a bit in their old age because they grow old with these passions, which become old maladies that are difficult to heal. You see, as one grows older, he begins to love his passions. Then the age of love, the age of affection comes, and one becomes even more lenient with oneself. One's will is also weakened, making the struggle against the passions even tougher. A young person is full of vitality. If this vitality is used for uprooting the passions, the spiritual progress is assured. How we will be delivered from the passions. Yarinda, why do I constantly fall into the passion of gluttony? Because that's where your weakness lies. The devil attacks the weakest outposts. He doesn't strike at the well-fortified ones. If I can take over this outpost, the devil says to himself, I can easily take over all the others, one by one. This is why the weakest outpost has to be the most fortified. Yarinda, I get overwhelmed when I see my passions. You mustn't be overwhelmed or become faint-hearted. With courage, examine your passions one by one, starting with the strongest one. At first, you shouldn't be too scrupulous, going through them with a fine-tooth comb. Instead, you should strike at the most obvious ones first and uproot them. As the roots of the greatest passions are incapacitated, the finer roots of the smaller passions will also dry out. Consequently, when you uproot one great passion, the smaller ones will also be uprooted with it. Yarinda, why is it that, while I make many decisions to struggle with zeal against my passions, I do not follow through with them in the end? It's because you make too many decisions all at once. The passions, like the virtues, form a chain. One passion is linked to another passion, and one virtue is linked to another virtue, much like the wagons are connected on a train, one behind the other, and all follow behind the first. So, if you decide to struggle for some time to uproot a particular passion and to cultivate a corresponding virtue, you will succeed. And by uprooting that passion, you will also be delivered from other passions, allowing for the corresponding virtues to be cultivated. Let's say you are jealous. If you struggle to not be jealous, you will cultivate love, goodwill, and you will simultaneously be delivered from anger, from condemnation, from evil, and from sorrow. Yarinda, is it better to do away with a passion or a bad habit at once, or little by little? If you can get rid of it immediately, it is best. Otherwise, it may leave some residue. There is no need for delay. When one is crossing a river, particularly in the winter, he tries to do it as quickly as possible. Otherwise, he'll freeze from the cold. If he crosses quickly, before being overcome by the cold, he will soon warm up again. You see, even tethered horses that want to get free will snap the rope with a sudden strong pull. Temptation requires a very sharp tug in order to sever the rope. Yerunda. Abba Isaac said, "Dispassion does not mean that one feels no passions, but that he does not accept any of them." Can a dispassionate person be stricken by passions? Yes, he can. But whatever the devil hurls at him is burned up by the divine fire that has been kindled within him. The devil does not stop attacking a person, but when one rejects these attacks, then his heart is purified and Christ dwells in him. His heart is turned into a furnace, into a burning bush, setting ablaze everything that falls into it. It is better to die heroically than to be overcome by the passions. Yerunda. Is gratitude toward God sufficient on its own in motivating us to struggle against the passions? Gratitude alone is not enough. It also requires a good disposition, acknowledgement of our sinfulness, and a philotimo-filled asceticism. Yerunda. Does the remembrance of death help in this inner work? Yes, it is very helpful. If we bear in mind the remembrance of death with hope in God, we will become aware of the vanity of this world and be helped spiritually. This is why we should keep the criterion, judgment, of God in mind and not forget that we will be judged for the sins we have committed and not repented for. What am I doing? How can I live with so much negligence? Should be our thoughts. If I should die right now, how will I be judged? Do I have a contract with death? Death comes both to the young and to the old. If I could keep in mind that God may call me soon, then I would not be so inclined to sin. For the passions to die, we must keep death in mind. Think of the future judgment and be ready to suffer ourselves, out of philotimo for the sake of Christ who suffered so much to redeem us. The struggle against the passions is a perpetual, sweet martyrdom of observing the commandments out of love for Christ. It is better to die heroically than to be overcome by the passions and wound Christ. Yerunda. I am pressured in my struggle. You pull out a little thorn from your finger and you hurt. So you can imagine how much more it will hurt when you uproot a passion from within you. But you must also know that when a person exerts effort to excise one of his passions, the evil one will present obstacles so that he feels pressured. Just like a possessed person is pressured when the prayers of exorcism are read for him, because there is an ongoing battle. He is fighting with the devil. However, in the end, he is liberated. Cleansing our inner self cannot be accomplished without effort, as if we are just pushing buttons. The passions are not severed at once, just as the trunk of a large tree can't be severed with one stroke of the saw. The saw has to go back and forth for a long time before the trunk is cut through. And the work does not stop there. It takes so much work to turn the trunk into furniture. First, it has to be sawed into planks, and then worked and shaped by a skilled carpenter in order to make it useful furniture. Yerunda, what if I don't understand that this effort is essential? Then you will remain as a bump on a log, and you will be thrown into the fire. For God to give, we must sow. Yerunda, every day I say, tomorrow I will be careful. I will correct myself. But I make the same mistakes all over again. You need to place God first by saying, with the power of God, I will try to correct myself, so that God will help. The fact that you wish to correct yourself means that you are open to receiving help. You ask for help from God, and He casts His glance upon you. You then make your small effort and move on. Is there anyone who wouldn't run to help a small child trying to roll a big rock with his little hands? This is also how God works. When He sees your small effort, He will help you overcome. There are some people who, while making no effort at all to correct themselves, say, "Lord Jesus Christ, I have these passions. You can deliver me from them. Deliver me." Well, how can they expect God to help them? For God to help, one has to make every effort he is capable of. In other words, there are certain things which a person has to do himself in order for God to come to his aid. No person can ever be helped if he doesn't want to help himself. We sometimes try to acquire God's grace and gifts through some magical means. We delude ourselves by thinking that we can acquire a virtue or even be sanctified without a struggle. However, for God to give, we must sow. How will God give if we do not work? What does the hymn say? "You have cultivated the barren desert." God will provide abundant rain to soften the soil, but we must also cultivate our field. The earth is ready, but we must put our hand to the plow and sow our field. And whatever we sow, we will reap. But if we do not plow, how can we sow? And if we do not sow, what will we harvest? For this reason, we should not only ask what God can do for us, but what we can do for ourselves. The Bank of Christ offers great interest rates. But if we make no deposit in His bank, how can we expect to make a withdrawal?